while. Hopefully the other two will show up. So this started actually with a friend of mine from Apple named Ernest Bruce, who kind of called me up out of the blue must have been like 2 or 3 years ago, pre-pandemic. All right. And so he had some crazy ideas how to fix the world. And I have a standard operating procedure for people like this, because this happens to me, you know, and I do this to other people too, is I gave him some homework and said, well, if you want to change the world, you need to do this, this, and this. And like, you have to come up with a plan for how to address these things. And most people I never hear back from again, but he actually wrote back and said, okay, this is what you asked me for, here's what I'm gonna do. And it's like, oh crap, now I can't just blow him off like I want to do, I have to actually take him seriously. And this led to what we ended up calling the Two Earnest podcast, Ernest Bruce and I. And there were a lot of rants about social media and centralized power. And he worked with me a little bit on a distributed sort of ad hoc social network I'm working on. And then we went in a few different directions. And then finally, I ran across this thing called the Zigzag Project, which is a podcast I listen to, but they have one of the things that they did is this sort of 6-step process to figure out what you should do with your life. So start with what you're feeling, and then talk about your values. And then, you know, each week you kind of do homework. And at the end of it, you come up with like a small set of ideas that you've already rated based on how much this aligns with your long-term vision, how much this aligns with your values, how easy it is to get started today, things like that. And Ernest went through the process very faithfully. It's all up on our podcast. And he said, well, there's 2 things that he came up with that I found that he was interested in pursuing, that I found really intriguing. One was this idea of wise or smart documents. One of his pain points is that he was a documentation editor at Apple and writer. And he says, you know, people don't put enough context in our documents to be able to understand them. And if we could just make these smart documents, which would embed all this context, that would make it way easier for people to understand them. So we talked about readability versus understandability and intelligibility, but it's like, okay, there's something there. And the other was creating an ecosystem built around pro-social status games. The idea is that you want people in an ecosystem to actually be trying to make the other participants healthier and stronger and wiser, rather than just exploit them for short-term gain. And those are 2 interesting ideas. What if we could do the 2 of them together? This idea that we build a little ecosystem that is around these context-aware smart documents, and we get people to play this pro-social status game as a way to build their businesses and cultures. Like, wow, if we could do that even at a small scale, that would be a really interesting thing to do. You still with me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And so we started with the name Datocracy, but after a couple of episodes, even I couldn't pronounce that. And we switched to the term Datocracy. And so we went through a series. So really the idea is we're going to interview a bunch of different people, but then we'd interview someone and say, oh, wow, this is really cool. I'd like to talk more about this. And we do a little mini series with them where we'd go over some of the problems they were interested in, where they overlapped. And where is everybody? I thought they were all joining me here. So anyway, you get the Cliff Notes version, and we'll see if Ernest. And then we did one arc with a guy named Anish who works for a company called Quilt Data that I'm an advisor at, which I used for our hackathon last month, if you may or may not have seen that. And we came up with sort of a set of manifestos or statements of values and principles about community data platforms, and coherency is the key to decision making. And then he had to go back to working on a startup. And then I just sort of Googled the word Datocracy and found out there was this guy named Tom Gilb in Scandinavia who has kind of wrote the book on quantitative software engineering metrics. Like the whole idea that when you're doing a release, you track the number of bug counts and see how you're doing numerically rather than just spitballing it. That was sort of the stuff that he was pioneering 30 years ago. And so he, as a side project, has built his version of Datocracy, which is coming up with, what if we could, instead of having elections where we just choose some random guy to make decisions for us, what if we could survey the population at a fine-grained level about their values and then empower someone to actually make data-driven decisions about what would actually be the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And so that's one version of Datocracy, is building this sort of—
Did you say that again? Sorry.
Siri is yelling at me and my dogs are yelling at me, so I need to take a break in a moment. So we started meeting with him and he's been great and been showing us all sorts of things. And then we said, well, rather than talking about how to fix society, let's just come up with a really small version of Datocracy that the three of us can use as a way to make decisions, as a prototype for how we want everyone to make decisions going forward. So that's the current narrative arc we are on. I can share some of the documents that we've worked on if that's of interest to you.
Okay, yeah, definitely.
Okay, so let's bring up a web browser here.
Ooh, I did not like that screen capture.
Sorry about that. I did the same thing to Ernest the first time.
Oh, boy.
We'll leave it on the black there.
All right.
Let's see, where did I need to use Google to find stuff I write because I lose track. Let's see if, there we go. This is where it's useful to have everything I've ever done being tracked somewhere. Let me just throw this up there while I go deal with my dogs and you can take a peek at it. Make it a little easier to read. Yeah, it's probably a little hard to see though. Okay.
Oh, yeah,
Leave it at that for now. All right.
All right. Well, for the sake of everyone who's watching, I'll just go ahead and read this out loud. So as a community who produces, consumes, and manages data, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Our most precious resource as a community is our ability to make better decisions together, coherency. Better decisions are enabled by higher quality data. And coherency increases as our communal data platform aligns the syntax of our producers with the semantics of our customers, the Datocrat's conundrum. And rational trust in decision makers is enabled by immutable public histories of past decisions and context, data sets, plus transparency of the decision-making process over time, analysis. Decision makers' values are best seen in data sets and analysis they collect, retain, use, share, ignore, and learn from the crucial conjecture. Our inherency is constrained by how fast our communal data platform can adapt to new realities. So forking culture enables us to simultaneously pursue both adaptation and coherency. The platform architecture must be built on open source standards and interfaces so we control our own evolution. And service providers may be used to provide well-defined components and innovative endpoints, but they won't constrain the overall architecture. And we will never do this perfectly, but the better we understand and document our decisions, learnings, failures, the more rapidly the next generation can improve on them. Okay.
Very nice, thank you.
So I mean, I have a couple of thoughts bubbling up, but are there any other parts that you want to bring up first?
So let me just go ahead and pull this up. Yeah, one more. So I showed this to our friend Tom, and he goes like, well, that's just words. It's like, well, you got to start somewhere. He goes, yeah, well, you should start with a plan. And so he challenged us to use something he calls planguage, which is sort of a formalized, we would call it a schema these days, for how you organize information in order to make better decisions. And it's been implemented in this commercial tool called ValPlan. And the kind of the punchline for it is, I think it's this thing here, is the idea that you come up with your values as a series of formal requirements, where you precisely define what are the words, the things you want, and the things that are important to you. And then you can use this formalism to go through and actually rank different ideas numerically against these things. So the idea is that, like, if we have a social problem we're facing, rather than just having a bunch of words people are throwing around, let's say, okay, I think it's important that we reach this level of, like, for example, he's done this with UN sustainability goals, taking them from just a series of words to a series of precise definitions, numerical measures, and then giving you this really analytical grid for evaluating decisions. And the idea is that way people are arguing about precise quantitative rankings rather than just vague hand-waving words. So that's kind of his take on Datocracy and generally planning in general. And I'm probably about 2/3 convinced that this is valuable. Like sometimes I worry we get so bogged down in the mechanics, it's hard to keep track of the intent. But it's certainly a fascinating exercise to go through how do you precisely define these words that matter to you, and then how do you turn that into something that you can measure whether you are making progress, which I think is definitely something that I think we talked about this before, that, or maybe it was Russell. Russell was the guy, the Russell Memorial Lunch we had with Russell, that like the only regrets I really have in life are where I failed to measure something before I fixed it. Because that's a learning I could have gotten that is now forever lost. And the idea that before you make a change, you build a way to measure it, test-driven development, right, is one of these things that is transformational in how you make decisions and is largely absent in the public policy sphere. And so that's one of the things that his vision of Datocracy pulls towards. Let's see if I can find where can I not find that? Original.
There is one.
Okay. So anyway, that's the other point I wanted to just bring up as a background, and then we can open it up to conversation and discussion. Well,
Okay, all right. So with this one, so of course I have a few questions right off the bat, but I will go ahead and start with the question of specialization. For example, let's say that there is an issue that deals with like climate, for example. Let's take climate change for one thing. And let's say that there is some data that comes in that runs against the current narrative. Now, I'm not a climate scientist, but I would likely have a bias against that data simply because of inertia, intellectual inertia. I've heard the same thing for the past 20 or so years, and an abrupt shift, regardless of how accurate it is or isn't, would have a hill to climb, even if it is truly accurate. And so I bring up a specialization because it seems that those who are knee deep in the data could find out that the narrative that I thought that I was following for so long wasn't as rock solid as I thought, and would be less susceptible to the inertia bias. So this is one example, but so would this mean that all topics would be brought to the general public, or would there be allowances for a specialization, similar to committees in Congress?
Yeah, so the way I think about this is that like Tom is really focused on Datocracy in the large, like how do we create a public political system that incorporates these things. I'm actually much more curious and interested, and actually think it's more important to start with Datocracy in the small. So the idea is that individual communities of experts or people interested in different fields, like this is how I wish everybody who has a stake in something would make decisions, right? Or it's not necessarily this full language thing, but something datocratic where, like for me during the pandemic, at the very beginning, like when someone, said, oh, you should do this, it's like, well, I don't know. But when someone actually sent me a live interactive model where it says, okay, here are all my assumptions. They're in this spreadsheet. And based on these assumptions, these algorithms, this is what's going to happen if we don't flatten the curve. And I didn't check everything, but just the fact that this human being was willing to document all of their assumptions, put them in a quantitative model to make it easy for me to tweak and challenge them, said, okay, this is somebody I trust. They have done the work to not just present themselves as an authority, but to allow me to check their work. And that's the interesting thing for me, is that, yeah, I want the people in authority to not just make good decisions, though that would be nice. I want them to make decisions in a really open statement about which data they're considering, what criteria they're using to make those decisions. And, and science at its best does this. Science as its norm doesn't always, hence the reproducibility crisis in many of the sciences. And it's no question that it's more expensive to try and show your work, and you lose some of the status gains you get by being first and things like that. And there is this fundamental tension between sort of, you want the freshest possible data and you want the most reliable possible data, right? And generally what happens is that the way this works in reality is you have gates and stages, right? So in science, you have your lab notebook, and then you have your drafts, and then you have public preprints, and then you have the official prints, and then you can have errata afterwards. And so there is a process which is painful and slow and corrupt, but that's another story. But at least there's a process, which is a huge leap over alchemy, where you just, pass down things by lore, and you jealously guarded your secrets so that nobody could steal from you. And so the goal is that right now we tend to operate in the realm of alchemy in most of our public decisions. And therefore, the idea is that we build, so there's a couple of things. One is that we want to build some tools and some processes to say, hey, if you're concerned about building this kind of a world, here are some best practices, here are some tools to use, here's a community of people who are trying to learn how to do this better. That's one piece of it. And the other is, actually, maybe that's most of it, frankly, is just it's trying to build a movement around, it's not like this is one way to do it and this is the right way to do it. It's like, no, this is a thing we are trying to do, and here's some ways to get better at doing it. That's kind of the basic idea. So the idea is that, the IPCC, if they actually were more precise, I mean, I don't know if it would make any difference for them, but they would say, okay, this is the, in Databricks, the data lake tool we use, they have this idea of gold. It's kind of a lame analogy, but bronze, silver, and gold. Like bronze is the fresh data right off of the primary systems. Silver is the pre-processed data where we've sort of done all those things we normally know how to do. And gold is the stuff that we've actually had a human review it and put a stamp on it and say, okay, yes, this is ready for external consumption. And the idea is that inside your community, you would say okay, the IPCC should be the one saying, this is what we've known before. This is the hottest data off the press. And then gold is sort of when they publish it to the UN and say, hey, this is the numbers we're going to stand behind because that. But, internally, you want to be looking at the silver data, right? And then the people who are actually the experts on that particular source mechanism be looking at the bronze data. And you have to have this sort of hierarchy or pipeline or whatever. And it's hard, right? Because a lot of our cultural norms are, if you see a number, it's true, or you're claiming it's true, and I can attack you for it if it's wrong. And having a little bit of, in order to have this level of transparency, you also need a certain level of sophistication and grace to let people have their sort of provisional data that is not quite correct in the interest of having more sophisticated customers look at it, but then not let that get confused with what people are sort of saying this is the gold data to stand behind. Did that answer your question?
Yes. Now, one key piece of that that comes to mind is who selects the experts, and how do you make sure that the list is that list of experts remains good? How do you maintain integrity and that aspect of the system?
Right. So I think there's an interesting shift in what do you mean by an expert, right? And we were already in the middle of that shift, right? That's kind of what's happened in the last decade, is that it used to be an expert was someone who had a lot of credentials and held a position of authority, right? So
Mhm.
if you've gotten a PhD from a brand name school and you're currently a professor sitting in a tenure position somewhere, or you hold this office, then we assume you're an expert. What's really, we'll call this, so that's one type of expert. There's a second type of expert, which is like this guy who sent me this, it was eventually forwarded me from somebody, the guy who built this COVID expansion model. It's like, okay, you don't know me from Adam, but let me show you how I approach the problem. Let me show you my data, and let me show you how I think. And it's like, okay, in this case, it's not his past credentials that is of interest to me. It's his present transparency that says, okay, this feels credible. And it's like, yeah, if I disagree with these numbers, this is the numbers I'd have to believe in order to prove him false. And he's made it easy for me to do that. And I say, okay, that transparency of thinking and transparency of data is a second kind of expert. It's like, this guy really seems to know his stuff. There's a third kind of category, which is moving sort of from proof of work to proof of stake, which is, let's call this authenticity. It's like, hey, I'm going to jump into this boat because I think that the village is going to catch on fire and burn. Will you come with me? And in this case, it's not so much that he's demonstrating any coherent analysis, but he has skin in the game, as Nicholas Taleb would say, in that he's putting himself in a position where he is vulnerable if he is wrong. And what's interesting is that the first type of expert is a little bit of that, right? If you have a reputation and status, the fact that you're willing to stick your neck out and say something is a lot more meaningful because you have a lot more at stake. You have a reputation to lose if you're wrong. Now, one could argue that society's got a little more dysfunctional in the last decade, where we no longer hold experts accountable for wrong predictions they make. But that's another side digression on the issue. But anyway, that's kind of my rant on being experts, is that there's different layers of it and different ways to evaluate it. And they all have pluses and minuses. And the best you can hope for is to have a immutable public history of past decisions, so that you can actually make a rationalist statement like, oh yeah, this guy comes from a really good school, but he's completely wrong about everything, versus this guy who's a nobody, but dang, he's made some really good predictions over the last 12 months. Maybe it should take him seriously. And if you could actually trust that immutable public history, you at least have not all trust is rational, but it's nice to at least have the option of making a rational trust statement based on predictions and consequences. This is the whole idea of Ethereum smart contracts, for that matter.
Yep. And I'd like to throw out that it might be worth it to look into the TED Talk organization's guidelines for those who host events, because they gave some guidelines on how to tell or how to distinguish between a charlatan and an actual expert. Especially if it's in a field I don't know. And unfortunately, I don't remember that off the top of my head, but that could be something worth looking at. The overall, it is like that. Like, it sounds on the surface that those ideas could work, but there are a few pieces that are worth looking at. Like, for example, with the COVID vaccine conundrums. So there's a lot of misinformation that's going out there, and a lot of this misinformation comes from people who are definitely putting themselves out there, saying, "Hey, we think that there's a conspiracy. We think that they're injecting our bodies with nanomachines," and they are presenting themselves as experts. Now, for you, me, and probably the audience, we would spot that right away. They don't really have much of a leg to stand on. But for a surprisingly large number of people out there, and a lot of whom are educated, a lot of whom are what we would ordinarily consider smart, A lot of people will fall into those into those sort of intellectual traps, and in my opinion, it's mainly because they have an emotional bias that is overriding their judgment.
Yes. So that was my other podcast. I have a podcast with a friend of mine, and we went into it over vaccines and COVID on a few episodes. And what was fascinating to me is that his basic premise was that the medical industry is corrupt and untrustworthy. And even though I come from a family of doctors, I'm a scientist, and it's like, the scientific industry is corrupt and untrustworthy, right? The journaling and the press publisher perish and groupthink are very much real things in science. On the other hand, the problem is that, like, yes, the mainstream is almost always wrong, but it's usually more accurate than most of the fringe, right? Yeah. And that's the awkward problem, is that, okay, yeah, I'm probably like only 90% correct about this, and you might be 99% correct on this, or you might be utterly wrong. And it's almost really beside the point, because what he pokes about all these studies and things. And actually last week, Tom Gill was talking about how there's these medicines which are widely available in Europe and have really good track records that the FDA is claiming are dangerous and should never be used. And he was arguing that that's because the decision makers are in bed with the big pharma companies that donate to their campaigns and fund their research. And like, I don't know for sure, but it's plausible, right? It could easily be the case that some of these things really are regulatory capture by incumbents, right? And it's not a priori obvious what's going on there. So there are certain things where having a immutable public history helps. So you could say, well, okay, but you said this and then you said that, and things like this. But I am absolutely convinced that the real interesting hard problems have nothing to do with the facts on the ground, but far more with our sense of identity. Like my friend Robbie, his public is on the podcast talking about it. It really for him was like a thing about good and evil. Like, we're the good guys who are really caring about the little guy and the truth. And it's these big, well-funded conspiracies, or the rich evil people who are the bad guys. And what it really struck me as was that narrative was more important to him than any of the facts. And if we couldn't address that narrative, there was no point in discussing the facts. And I actually had a real breakthrough with him in our last phone call, because he was going on about, I told this to you over lunch, right? But that he was talking about, well, I just remember there's a time when I could have conversations with people about difficult subjects and, not feel threatened. And now I just feel like the mainstream narrative is just crowding out all the alternatives. And I said to him, you got to give me a break here, because I suddenly feel really colored and feel like you're really white, which is a very rare thing for me, growing up mostly, mixed in with white culture. Is that, like, last I checked, the mainstream narrative has always squelched out alternatives. And it's just happened that in the last few decades, you flipped. So you're no longer the mainstream. And so now you're dealing with the rest of us had to deal with all our lives. And to his credit, he goes, you're right. I just realized that the reason I got along with everybody is because they basically agree with me. And when I stopped agreeing with people, they've kind of fallen out of my circle. And that's a problem. I need to do something about that. And whether he'll remember that in our next conversation, I don't know. But I feel like that's what has to happen. People have to say, oh yeah, I was holding on to this view of reality, but I'm suddenly, and I think it's frankly out of the relational connection and trust that I built up, what I would call even grace, right? When I can hear him and get to a place where I can say, help me understand what you're saying, because this doesn't make sense to me, as opposed to where I feel like, no, you're wrong and I have to prove you wrong, right? If you start out assuming someone is wrong, and if you have an emotional need to prove them wrong, then they will not trust you and they will not become vulnerable. But if you can create that safe space where they can explore their own doubts and where they feel like you've heard them and they're willing to hear you, then there's at least a chance of creating this empty space or this neutral space in the middle and say, maybe I'm not quite sure about that. Let me go back and rethink that. And that's the difficult, hard emotional work of creating these safe spaces, one-on-one over time, which is the only way to really solve the really deep issues.
When it comes to that, when it comes to dealing with the emotional side of things, I feel that there are, well, actually, to sort of contradict what I just went on about, I believe that that is one area where that could actually be best served by the fringes. The idea is that, I've, all right, I should probably go into like a little bit of background, just very high level. But basically, I grew up in the Bay Area in Oakland. Didn't exactly have the best of childhoods growing up. And I spent a huge chunk of my later teens and early adulthood in Ohio and North Carolina, mostly in Ohio, which didn't exactly do well for my emotional state. Ohio, in my opinion, rural Ohio is a great place if you want everything to stay the same forever, so, or close enough. So things changed a lot when I returned to the Bay Area because I started to dive into some of the fringe parts of society. And some of those pieces ended up producing a sort of almost a quantum leap in my internal emotional state, in my ability to perceive and do things, and my ability to grow as a person, which eventually ended me at where I am now, professional software engineer doing stuff. So it seems that a lot of times those on the fringes who would ascribe labels to, such as hippies, or in my case, like let's go with New Age, or even participants at Burning Man. That's actually a great example. They can address a lot of times they can address the aspects of our society, the emotional aspects of our society that we generally don't pay any attention to, which is allowed to fester and get us stuck in vicious cycles. So for me, something that addresses the data side of our social problems, data integrity side, which is a very big problem, no question of it. Something like that, I believe, in order for it to be fully effective, should at least, let's go with be paired with, or along with something, maybe even incorporate something that addresses the emotional side of the problem as well. Because at this point, there are many people who have just been broadcast or been shouted at, and who have seen so much negative information that their perspectives of view are currently calcified. And it takes, and they're not exactly happy either, either on the left or the right end of the political spectrum. So dislodging that, I think, is a big challenge. And that could, and basically that just, that should be a component of how we address these social issues.
Right. Well, and I'll, cards on the table, right? I'm a Christian, my spiritual perspective on a lot of these things. I am absolutely convinced that the fundamental solution to our problems is a spiritual, relational, emotional one, right? It's about how I grow individually as a human being, in my own consciousness, in my awareness of others, in my awareness of myself, in my awareness of the universe, and able to create encounters with people where they're brought into a place of greater vulnerability and authenticity, and willing to let go of the things that, entrap us. What's interesting, and I don't really get to choose my agenda, I sort of try 100 different things and then 2 or 3 of them stick. What's weird is that the 2 things that have stuck out of all this has been this sort of mostly divergent the spiritual paths are trying to create these sort of relational encounters, and then the technical thing around datocracy, which in like my day job is basically what I spend my time worried about, is trying to build data systems with numbers that help our organization, our mutual employer, make better decisions together, rather than getting into data brawls that end up burning weeks at a time and crushing people's souls. And what's weird is that there's this weird feedback loop I'm in, where like, okay, I have to go through these spiritual practices and relaxation so that when I'm confronting these data crises that we used to get quite a lot of in the last month, I do not react in a way that makes the problem worse. Mm-hmm. And so it is really strange that personally these two things are deeply intertwined, but at this point, sort of intellectually, they're two separate trends. The other thing that's really funny, since you mentioned that, is I don't know if you've heard the phrase the modern data stack. It's basically, you remember, were you doing software before Agile showed up, or was it always part of the water you swam in?
Probably came in right when it
Did you write
was,
substantial software before you? Did you ever write a substantial piece of software without unit tests?
Well, I personally have.
Did you know it? Did you ever do it? Did you ever do it not realizing there was a different way?
Actually, yes, I did.
Okay.
So, yeah, so I probably come in right at the cusp of the introduction of like Agile, and I have I've written stuff. I do predate the unit test frenzy a little bit. Came in right at the cusp of that as well. I have my own thoughts on unit tests. We'll save that for another day.
Yeah.
So
unit tests are one of these shibboleths that has become a good signpost of where you are, not necessarily the most or the universally valid part about Agile. But but you understand the idea, though, right? Is that there was a period of time when like the concept of testing, automated testing of software just didn't exist. Correct. And then it became like a religion. And then they became like a calcified religion where it would punish heretics and so forth. Okay, and there's the life cycle. But regardless, like you do look back on the world before we had automated tests, and like, my God, how barbaric was that? And we would just like randomly write software and ship it out there. And we had no clue whether it worked at all. And if things would break, we would just randomly scurry around fixing things until it broke the next time. Right? That was the world that, I remember. And so I have that conversion story. What's interesting is that the data world's going through a similar phase transition where it's going from a world where data was just this thing that sit in a central database and you spit out a report. So in the olden days, there was just like one database, one mainframe, and the high priest would give you a number and that was it. And then Microsoft's real claim to fame is you could take that number, put it on your PC, and like make your own insights and not wait 6 months for central IT to give you a report. And that led to the world we're in today, where now every group has their own database. And when the CEO, with the old saying, like if a guy with one watch knows what time it is, a guy with two watches is never sure. And this leads to the quarterly data brawl, where the CEO asks for a number, he gets 3 different versions of that number, none of which match the numbers from last quarter. And then this is big fight about what we're going to present at the board meeting, right? We don't literally have that problem at NATO, but we have versions of that. And so does almost everybody in the industry. And so the modern data stack is a bunch of technologies around the cloud, but it's basically trying to bring that sort of continuous integration, continuous deployment, unit testing, literally unit testing to data, so that you can actually say, this is the data, this is exactly how we got here, these are the anomalies we detected, and we can just push a button and rerun it again next month and get the exact same numbers out, right? That's the dream of the modern data stack, is to bring all these, what we call, now that software engineering has gotten to be a much more high leverage activity, everyone wants to be software engineering. Right, so people in other parts of the business envy the tools, and it's like, okay. So what's fascinating, that was a huge digression to make the point that at the Coalesce conference this last week, which is run by DBT, they're the kind of the node of databases for SQL. one of the big takeaways from it was actually the culture. And people started talking about the modern data culture stack. And they've got a really fascinating culture that they've created on the DBT Slack, where all the other companies are kind of hanging out there. And it's incredibly sort of pro-diversity. Like, every speaker has their random choice of pronouns that they want to be identified with, right? That's just part of the norm of how they create this thing. But they've managed to do it in a way that someone like me, who's like tends to be relatively traditionalist in my values, didn't feel like I was excluded or a foreigner. And they've created a really beautiful culture around celebrating sort of weirdness and diversity without being aggressive about it, which can often happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's fascinating that the one place that is sort of on the cutting edge of datocracy, if you will, and data-driven decision-making, there was a post claiming that they're actually probably on the cutting edge of what a welcoming, diverse, inclusive culture looks like, which has not always been the case for software engineering.
Mm-hmm.
One could argue it's never been the case for software engineering. It started out with sort of a reverse discrimination that only women could be computers. And then we sort of had all sorts of chaos and chest thumping around it. And what's interesting to me about that lesson is that there is this cycle of you're part of a community, but then you have an experience where you realize, well, I use the term logos to describe kind of the logic of how a community operates, like biology was the logos of living things, right? And where you realize that the logos that defines this community doesn't work for me, that the rules, the logic, the norms, like, wait, this is not working for me. And then you kind of go off by yourself and you find your weird little tribe where they say, yes, you're right. Those people, they're all evil, they're stupid, they're idiots. Like, we're the truth, this is the right way. And you feel so loved and valuable. Oh my gosh, this was Peter Rabbit, the movie I watched with my daughter last night. Anyway, and then it turns out that like this wonderful community that was accepting you was actually a bunch of con men and they're just as broken and flawed as the mainstreamers. But then the thing is to then come back, and this is the idea of a data fork. Like, it's important to be able to fork. You want to be able to say like, no, this is not working. Let me make it work for myself. But then you have to do the pull request where you come back and say, okay, now that I've learned this, like, I think that there's something here that the mainstream should really adopt. And let's have that argument in the pull request about how to fold these ideas back to the mainstream and normalize them with the rest of the thing. And this dynamic of specialization and normalization, of connecting and individuating, that feels like, and I'm arguing actually is sort of a fundamental idea of what it means to be human and what we mean by spirituality. And what's interesting is that things like GitHub, things like immutable data histories, actually make this a lot easier to do and a lot more richer than it's ever been in human history. That you can literally fork a community and specialize it, but then you can say, well, let me merge this back to you. And you actually have not just tools, but the whole concept of a pull request as a fundamental unit of human argument. And so there's this weird synergy between these two things. And I don't know how they're going to play out, which one's going to blow up first, if they're going to sort of converge in some great age of Aquarius, or if there's like one or two other components that I'm totally oblivious to that actually need to make the other two work. So, but yeah, it's all on the table. And so, like the Datocracy group is really focused on the sort of social process of data-driven decision-making, as well as the, some minor arguments around the tools. And then there's a whole industry working on, how to monetize that and scale that, even if they don't understand what the problem is.
Okay, well, let me throw out a couple of ideas that came to mind as we were talking about these things. So first off is the idea of, as we're pursuing the new, let's not throw out a lot of the old ideas that have gotten us this far in our society. So for example, we've learned after a while that our big one of the biggest pieces of that's helped us is not to go with one system or another system. Like, for example, I would say government systems. What's the best government system? Is it a direct democracy? Is it representative democracy? Is it a oligarchy? Is it a monarchy? And as it turns out, the answer is yes. Our best systems,
depending on the context, yeah.
Yeah, but our best systems are a hybrid of all of them and have aspects of each or one of them.
Let me say more front. Our most anti-fragile systems are those which can adaptively adopt different structures in response to different events.
Yes, but there are some parts that are just fixtures. Most systems have a court, which is an oligarchy. Most systems have a central leader that represents a monarchy. Most of them have a legislature. Most of them have at least some form of direct democracy, even if it's just electing representatives or that sort. So with this system, we want to, I think it would be wise as we're looking at how to govern this, to pick little bits and pieces from a regular government system. And one key thing that I think is important is to have governance being handled by a single centralized organization, however that's structured. But there's one place that's responsible for setting and modifying the rules for the rest that the rest of the system is built on top of. So I think
the question is, of course, it depends what you mean by centralized versus decentralized, and what do you mean by the rules. So I think I agree with you in some, let me be more precise. I actually have come to the conclusion that the most important thing that needs to be centralized and that everyone needs to agree on and that we have to move in lockstep on is how we record data. Is that if we have an interplanetary, multi-solar system, human federation of worlds, a la Star Trek, the most important thing is that everyone agrees that they report data in a consistent, coherent format so we can share each other's learnings. And that, various political and religious and tribal affiliations may end up doing things that we find totally abhorrent in their little subculture. But given enough geographical distance, you kind of need to let people do their thing. As long as they're at least reporting on it, it's like, hey, they may discover some weird higher evolutionary state of humanity that will save us all, or they may all kill each other. But as long as we learn from them, we should be willing to let them kind of do their own thing. But most of us would prefer to live in some sort of mainstream where we say, okay, in this larger community, we want to guide by these norms. We don't horrify each other and we don't kill each other. Understanding that we're making a trade-off of losing some diversity in some edge cases in order to maintain that semblance of normality. And that is kind of what we have today, is if you want to go out to the wilds of, Idaho, or, some urban enclaves or some hippie communes, you can live well outside the mainstream. And, depending on how strongly coupled you are to the rest of the culture, like Burning Man, right? You can go into the desert and live by a different set of norms than you would normally live in an everyday life. And as long as you're doing it out there, it's got sufficient sort of geo-relational distance that you can get away with that. And there's some value in that. But it's also, there's also considerable danger in that, right? The danger and threat and opportunity are all tied together. And whatever system you build has to have a way to let people sort of carve off their crazy ideas and try it. And you may have different thresholds for what you let people get away with or how hard it is to do that. But it needs to be necessary in order for the system to be adaptive, is to allow the fringes to experiment in ways that have a lot of risk for the participants, but minimal risk for the rest of society.
Yeah. Which
is a startup, also, when you think about it.
Yep, and there's another piece that I'll borrow from our market economy. is that they really do focus on like letting the best person win. So to bring it back to a point you raised earlier, yes, I do believe in forking ideas, but when it comes to merging it back into the trunk, I would actually argue that it could be better. I'm not sure about this, but it could be better to simply let a new fork grow on its own. And if it ends up being the winner, however that looks, then the old system would collapse and die on its own.
Right. So that's right. That is the one. And this is the funny thing. I'm still trying to find the right terminology for this. Is there's sort of the things that happen within the context of the existing system, right? And then there's this concept of the next generation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those at the bottom of one of my manifestos.
Or evolution.
Evolution, right? Is that like, actually there are certain things which are clearly the right thing to do and clearly impossible for me to do. Like, look today, like we built our business around Amazon S3, which was clearly the right decision 6 years ago, when Nauto was founded, or 7 years ago. Really the best game in town, practically the only game in town 7 years ago. Now you look and say, oh crap, there's a huge amount of lock into AWS because of their exit fees. If I was going to build something today, I'd start with Cloudflare or some edge network, so I don't have to pay that lock-in price. It's like, okay, clearly the right thing to do next term if I'm worried about these issues. But it is ridiculous for Nauto to worry about that at this point. It's like, yes, we're paying a tax for Amazon. The tax is low relative to our survivability, and the cost of switching is incredibly high. It's not something we need to worry about, in the short term or maybe even the medium term. But it is certainly something the next generation, I would encourage them is like, okay, like this is the best decision we made, but I would encourage you to make a better decision next time. And so the idea that you have this environment where new things can grow and it's a dynamic decision, right? Is this something, the old decision, are the things my kids can teach me that I can adopt? Or the things like, when you start your credit history, start it on Bitcoin rather than in with a social security number, that's probably a better thing. Like, I'm never going to get to that point in my life, likely. I mean, that's not necessarily true, but that's a sort of a hypothetical, right? You can imagine, like, I've wondered, should I get my son to spend more time learning how to trade Ethereum than to get into college? I don't know the answer to that question.
That's
there's a credible case that Ethereum will be worth more than a college degree in 8 years. There's a certainly possibility it won't be, but it's maybe 70-30, 80-20.
That is a conversation I would love to dive into, because I have my own thoughts on college degrees and their viability in the long run. But one key piece, circling back to the system, so we have a market economy. We have a need for a centralized. Oh, by the way,
we have 5 minutes left, so we should probably go into summarizing things. And yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, so I'll just summarize this. The main reason why I would focus on having that central organization and knowing people, that central organization is probably going to have to be surprisingly robust, because it'll have to serve a number of functions. There's a number of reasons why this new systems that work have some sort of a central authority. Right,
but just to be clear on terminology, central authority with distributed power is a decentralized system, right? A distributed system has no central authority. A centralized system typically has centralized power and centralized authority. So I wonder if you're arguing for centralized authority rather than a fully centralized system.
Centralized authority, not a centralized system.
So right. It'll be absolutely.
Yeah, basically rule makers. That's right. Basically what I'm talking about. Because not only do you have to deal with issues like consistency, like that was one of the reasons why we switched to the United States form of government versus the one before, because we needed a single standard for currency. So, right. But in addition to that, people are people. and people like to hack systems. People like to get around rules. So we're going to need a central authority that can adapt to all of those little hacks and maybe put new rules in place as people figure out new ways to screw things up. I think that's just inevitable in any system.
Yeah, no, I think the interesting thing though is that, I'll leave this my closing thought, is that I think that's actually true. What's interesting to me is how these things get unbundled, right? It is not hard to imagine a world where political government and economic governance and social governance are decoupled into different layers of the stack. I mean, that's kind of what happened in Europe. Whether or not it worked or not is another question. But it's and Neil Stephenson, my man. And that's one of the interesting questions is which things do you want to centralize more? Which things do you want to decentralize more? And how do you build sort of a mechanism that allows you to experiment with different policies?
Yep, that's a very good question. And I guess we'll have to end it on that one. I do have some thoughts, but we can say that for the next time.
Yeah, if you want, I can add you to the iMessage thread with Tom and Ernest, and you can follow up there.
Oh yeah, I'd like that.
So far, we're all still Apple bigots, so we can do everything on iMessage.
All right.
Speaking of centralized authorities. All right, take care, Alonzo. Thanks for joining me.
All right, have a